way that they were correct, that they needed to have agency in this situation. And so what we proposed was that we would open this discussion to the entire group and allow the entire group to engage in discussion about this, and that at the end of the discussion, we would take a vote, and that the entire group would abide by the majority decision. So with some reservations, almost everybody agreed to that. And so that's what we began to do. The next 3 or so hours was one of the most extraordinary Beit Midrash experiences I've ever had, study hall experiences. Because in this crowd, educated, uneducated people had insight and awareness and experience that was quite extraordinary. And they brought all of that to open discussions of what was the right thing to do in this situation, what was the fair thing to do in this situation, what was the spiritually correct thing to do, what was the ethically correct thing to do. Who would have to assume responsibility for the consequences in these kinds of situations? And at various points in time, the group broke up into subgroups to discuss things and then regathered. And by around 1 o'clock in the morning, everybody was exhausted. Everything that needed to be said seemed to have been said. And we took a vote. And the vote was by not unanimous, but by far the majority vote was that we, the clergy, should inform Commissioner Baker that we are not leaving. And everyone agreed to abide by that decision. So we went out, we told the police officers that Mr. Baker had told us to call him whenever we make our decision. So we wanted to call him, and they said, yes, he told them that they should call to him. And we called and we told him our decision. And after a string of uncomplimentary things that he had to say about us, and he told us that we should just be aware that we will in fact bear the consequences, that we should assume responsibility for the consequences that these young men will suffer. We went back into the room. I had been spending a lot of the time during this discussion and before it and then after it with one particular young man. There was a local Black person who lived in Selma. And we had spent an enormous amount of time talking to each other, and then eventually everybody went to sleep or stayed up or whatever they did. The dawn broke. I was able to daven Shachrit, as much of it as I knew by heart. At that point, I knew more by heart than I do now, because in my more advanced years, I decided that knowing davening by heart is very bad for me. Because it makes it much easier for me to sort of skip things and not to concentrate on what I'm saying, because I'm saying it because I know it so well, and that I need to read from the text when I'm davening. And sometimes I need to switch sidurim, even nusach of sidurim, so that the text will be a little bit different, and so it'll keep me focused on. In any case, so I davened, I did what I could do. I certainly did not actively violate Shabbat in any way. I was not able to have my second Su'udah, as I had not been able to have my first Su'udah, but, and I didn't have, I again could fulfill the Rabbanan requirement related to affirming the Kedusha of Shabbat. And then at around, must have been late in the morning, or at 11 o'clock in the morning, again, a police officer entered the room, and he brought a message from Mr. Baker. The message was that they were not going to book any of us because in consequence of the fact that the march was going to begin on Sunday morning, Selma had been flooded with media from all over the world. And Mr. Baker felt that it would be bad for the reputation of Selma to, in the midst of the presence of all of those media people, to have to announce that they had just booked 40 clergymen and a group of 250 people for having a public demonstration in the white neighborhoods of Selma. And so instead, they had decided that they were going to release us all. But they said, it would not be safe for us to be wandering through the white neighborhood because negative feelings about the forthcoming march were very strong. And we should not be wandering through the streets at this point. And therefore, they've arranged for buses to come. And the buses would take all of us back to Brown's Chapel. And there we could resume whatever it was that we were planning to do. So after his announcement, I turned to my friend and I said to him, listen, you know, it's Shabbat for me. And it has been a very difficult Shabbat because, you know, I've not been able to have the kinds of experiences that would normally, I've had other kinds of spiritual experiences here, but not the kind that normally nourish me. And I, you know, I don't drive on Shabbat. I also don't ride on Shabbat if I can manage to avoid it. And here's a situation where I can manage to avoid it. I'll walk back. I'll walk back to Brown's Chapel. So he said to me, no, you're crazy. You really can't. And what he said is true. I mean, feelings in the community are very powerful right now. People are very agitated. If you go walking through the streets, you know, I don't know that you're going to make it back alive. So I said to him, listen, you know, I've been, because of the voter stuff that we were doing, I've been in and out of the white neighborhoods a lot. I know where the bars are. I know, you know, which streets I have to avoid because people tend to gather there. You know, I'm pretty confident, and I won't be walking with everybody else. I won't be walking with a dozen Black people. I'll be walking myself. So, you know, I won't arouse that much antagonism. And he said, no, you're crazy. You can't do that. It's irresponsible of you to do that. You can't do that. And I said, listen, you know, I'm somewhat adult. So I said, that's what I'm planning to do. So at that point, everybody sort of tried to say goodbye to other people and to talk and to sort of pull together whatever stuff they had left on the floors. And about 40 minutes later, the police officer came back in and said, the buses are about to arrive. They'll be lined up shortly. So I want everyone to line up near the steps at the exit of the building. So everybody got up and lined up, and there was sort of an exit to the building. There were a bunch of 10 steps or so going down after that. And the officer in front waited until the buses were lined up right in front of the building. And then he said, okay, everybody should go down now. And the people at the front line did not move. So I was standing, I think probably about 6 lines in, 6 rows in, and I sort of heard what they said, but it didn't make any sense to me. And they said, no, we're not going. And the officer said, what do you mean you're not going? Of course you're going. You're going on the buses. You want to get killed? You're going on the buses. So the officer said, well, listen, there's a rabbi here. It's his Sabbath. He doesn't ride on the Sabbath, and we're not going to leave him alone. And the officer started cursing at them, and they absolutely insisted. And as the word spread, I mean, I don't know how that had gotten organized. I never found out how that had gotten organized and how it had gotten organized without my hearing that it was being organized. But I heard it happening, and the whole group behind were nodding in agreement with what they had said. And the officer sort of cursed for a while and then said, he's going to get Mr. Baker onto this. So he called Mr. Baker, and he came back and he said, okay, you don't have to get on the buses, but it is really not safe for you to be walking through these streets. And so we're going to accompany you walking. And so at that point, approximately 250 strong, we were marching through the main streets of the white neighborhood of Selma with a phalanx of buses on one side of us and a line of police officers on the other side. But since they couldn't stop us, we were singing, and we were, you know, we were doing stuff that could clearly be heard blocks away. And And so, after all of these months, if not longer, that the sort of the established community in Selma had been working to protect sort of the white neighborhood, we were marching through that way until we got to Brown's Chapel. So I want to talk briefly about what I learned in all of this. There are numbers of things that I learned, not necessarily in this order. But first of all, I learned that when people have a sense of honest working together to achieve a vital goal, that ties can then be created which are deeply honest and deeply protective. That the understanding that had developed amongst these 250 people, extraordinarily diverse crowd, but the sense that they were engaged in a mission together and that they shared a value that was vital to all of them, even though they might disagree on lots of other stuff, and we did. There was no question. I mean, even in the community of blacks who were there were some who were more associated with SNCC and with CORE and with a half a dozen other black organizations, and did not particularly love Martin Luther King because they felt that he was in it for himself, and that they were in it in a more active and a more energetic way, and nevertheless, all of us and the whites were clearly in it for very divergent reasons. And nevertheless, having engaged in this process together, there was a kind of tie that was developed, bond that was extraordinarily powerful, and that bond needed to be respected and honored, and it was. Secondly, it alerted me to the importance of tochacha, the importance of chastisement. And through that, the importance of voting. Because in all of that talking to people about voting and why they wanted to vote and why it was so important to them that they should get a vote, and in understanding why there were people who were so deeply resistant to blacks voting, I understood that voting is a contemporary form of chastisement, of rebuke. When the Torah tells us that we should not hate one another, because we need to be able to rebuke each other out of love. Voting is one of those mechanisms of rebuke. It's a way of saying to politicians that either I agree or I don't agree, and I need you to understand why I agree and why I don't agree. And the right to vote is the right to raise one's voice in a context in which that may be the only mechanism of agency that one has for oneself. And without that, one's entire political identity, and in many ways, one's entire Tselem Elokim is being denied. One's identity as someone having been created in the image of God is denied in their vote being denied. And he also understood more deeply than ever before the sense of responsibility that each one of us bears for the conduct of the society within which we live. Remember that the law of the laws of Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol, of not placing a stumbling block before the blind, of not enabling people to act wrongfully, which in the Talmud is at one point illustrated by not providing guns to people who might use them in the commission of a crime, right? Whether they be Jews or non-Jews. Because the principle of Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol applies not only to fellow Jews, it applies equally to non-Jews. And the Talmud itself insists on that being the case, that it is not permissible for us to enable non-Jews to live in violation of the Noahide commandments. That applies to us here, right here in the United States, in any country in which we live, that we are bearers of responsibility for the ethics and the moral character of the society within which we live. And then one last thing that I want to mention. Rabbi Posner mentioned at the very beginning, when he began to introduce me, mentioned this passage in chapter 2 of, I think it's chapter 2 of Exodus, where the Torah actually describes to us, as he pointed out, why God chose Moses to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. And it was because of that series of 3 stories that the rabbi described. The first, that Moses was able to stand up to fight for fellow Jews, to protect them against non-Jews. But that also he would stand up to prevent Jews from fighting each other. And he would denominate as a rasha any Jew who would threaten violence against a fellow Jew. And then in the third story, that Moses would understand that he also bore that responsibility, being in Midian, being there, he bore a responsibility to prevent an injustice from happening. And that Moshe, in a sense, therefore embodied a fundamental value of Jewish life that the Torah was attempting to teach us. And that there's another level to that, if you stop and think about it. Because in the first instance, Moshe used violence. He saw there was no one else who would protect this Jew, and so he used violence against a non-Jew to protect the Jew. And we in this generation, after the Holocaust and after the birth of Israel, we have also learned that lesson, that there are times when it's necessary to use violence against violent people in order to protect fellow Jews. In the second story, Moshe didn't have to use violence. Moshe only had to raise his voice. And so he did. He raised his voice in criticism, right? In tochacha. He said, Rasha, lama takareacha. Evildoer, why would you threaten to strike your neighbor, your fellow Jew? In the third story, the Torah does not even tell us what Moshe did. It just says that Moshe arose and he rescued them and enabled them to water their flocks, the daughters of Yitro. So it seems to me that at various points in our lives and in various points of the history of the Jewish people in modern times, there are moments in which we need to use force. There are other moments in which we are not called upon to use force. There are moments, however, when we are called upon to raise our voices. And there are yet other points where we don't have to use force. And we don't even have to raise our personal voices. But we have to indicate that we stand for something. We have to be willing to arise and stand for something that is right and just. So I think that's true for all of us, for each one of us. There are people here who have been in situations in which they have needed to use force in order to achieve justice. There are many here who have been called upon to raise their voices. But I think for every one of us, there are at least moments when we need to be able to simply stand up and indicate our presence in support of something that's true and just. So that's what I learned from my experience in Selma. I would be glad to expand on any of this and more stuff if you raise some questions for me. But I appreciate the opportunity to have shared this my experiences with you.
Wow. Well, wow. I have to take a deep breath. We appreciate you sharing them with us, because that was that was unbelievable. I can't believe that an hour went by. Felt like about 10 minutes. I could have had you go on. So thank you. A few questions came in that I want to raise. First of all,
Sure.
just on behalf of her fellow Wexner, someone shared that Cass Gottlieb got on. You may
Yes,
have not
Cass, I noticed her. I didn't
seen
get a
her
chance to wave to her
earlier,
because I
so
would be waving to
welcome,
everybody. Cass, it
welcome,
was good to
Cass.
see you.
Yeah, and welcome, Cass. Also is no longer in Baltimore, so we're happy to see you
Mhm. Oh,
on the screen with us. So I'll ask a few questions that came in along the way, and a couple of my own. You don't have to answer this very specifically, but one person said that's a lot to go to undergo. You must have been relatively young when that was happening.
yes.
Um,
Well, it was 1965, and I was uh, 20. I had just celebrated my just before my 26th birthday. Um, so I was quite young at the time. I was my third year already as rabbi of the congregation in Berkeley. I'd finished law school and then finished my rabbinic training and then finished law school and then came to serve as a rabbi in Berkeley. I was married at the time. My wife, with whom I am married now for 58 years, um, and and we're her. In any case, uh, um, my wife was um, supported this decision, but was not there in Berkeley at the time because she was actually on a train going cross country to be present at a wedding of a cousin of hers because we couldn't afford a flight at that time. So she took the train cross country. In any case, but she was very supportive. In fact, she was in my parents' home in Bedford Stuyvesant, in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. She was visiting with them during that time when a telephone call came in from my brother who lived in Far Rockaway at the time, telling my parents that they should quick turn on the television because they'll see me at the demonstration, at one of the demonstrations that was taking place in Selma at the time. My parents had not been told. My brother had not been told. There was no one in the family was told that I was there. I was not planning to tell my parents until I was back safely. Um, but in any case, yes, I was young and I was much more energetic in those years.
I don't know about that, but you seem to have plenty of energy.
Thank you.
Um, believe I know. So um, it's interesting. The questions that came in along were very, I guess, sort of like personal, going to what was going on for you. Were you were you scared? You must have been scared. And how did you deal with that?
Yeah. There were a number of points at which I was frightened. I mean, certainly at that, it began, my fear really began during the ride from Montgomery to Selma, because um, what had been happening is that we were loaded into a car and there was a caravan of about 10 cars that all left at the same time and drove very closely to each other. Um, the reason for that was that um, up until very recently, if a car had been driving along in which there were whites and blacks together in the car, headed from Montgomery to Selma, then it was what often would happen is that a car would sort of swoop in front of the car, and then another car would pull up close behind, and then the first car would slow down, forcing the car in the middle to come to a stop, locked between those two cars. People would get out of the front and back cars, drag people out of the cars and beat them and leave them lying on the side of the road. And so for protection, they decided that no car should go alone along the road. They should only travel in caravans. And it was during that ride that we heard the story of the death of of Jimmy Lee Jackson from his uncle, who was not present at the time, but who knew the story because he had been told exactly what had happened by uh, by uh, by the common his um, uh, the grandfather who had been there and Jimmy Lee Jackson's mother. Now, what's interesting is that Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed on February 18th, 1965. Um, Everybody knew who the police officers were. Everybody knew exactly what had happened. There were, of course, people who were in denial. I mean, there are still people to this day who believe that they have the right to deny facts. Um, but it was not until May 2007, 42 years later, that Bernard Fowler was indicted for the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson. He was indicted and he pleaded guilty in a plea deal in November of 2010, and he was sentenced to 6 months in jail. In the vast majority of the instances that I've told you about, and the vast majority of these 50 to 100 just in that decade, no one was ever called to justice for having committed those bombings, or well, some have been occasionally, but vast majority of people were not called to justice for having committed those homicides. And in fact, the week, not 2 days after I left Selma, the Monday following the march, a woman was shot and killed transporting people back from Montgomery to Selma to resume civil action demonstrations in Selma. So, was I as aware of that at the time as I maybe should have been? No, I don't think so. I was young and I felt immune to most things. So I did what I did. In retrospect, there were things that I did, certainly some of the occasions walking through the streets of the white neighborhoods in Selma, where it was, significantly irresponsible. But I guess, that's what younger people do.
So obviously, to a certain extent, you answered this just by your whole presentation, but just like very directly, what made you go?
So there were a number of influences on me in this regard. One was that I grew up in Bed-Stuy, and as a young person in Bed-Stuy, when I was growing up there in Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, when I was growing up there, it was a white neighborhood. It had Jews and it had Irish and Italian Catholics. The relationship between the Jewish kids and the Catholic kids was, on the whole, pretty good, except for a month before Christmas and a month before Easter. Because then we were not just Jews to them, then we were Christ killers. And so we couldn't play stickball with them in the streets at that point because the sticks were more likely to hit a Jewish kid than they were to hit the ball. So those were difficult moments, but otherwise, there was a very free atmosphere. We lived out in the streets, we played ball, we did all sorts of things in the streets. And then in the very edge of that decade, one Black family moved onto the block. They moved into the house right next door to us, into a brownstone. We lived in a brownstone. They bought the brownstone right next door to us. They're a very wonderful young couple. They had one child. We had no fence between our backyard and their backyard, and for the duration of the time that we lived there, we had very warm and wonderful relationships with them. But by a year after that, we were the last white family living on the block. At the time, it was referred to as white flight. It was not white flight, it was fear mongering. It was what at the time came to be referred to as blockbusting by realtors. Within a week after that black family moved onto the block, there were realtors who were going door to door, knocking at people's doors and saying, "You own this house? Yes? Well, listen, if you're willing to sell it now, I can probably find somebody who'd be willing to buy it from you for about 18, maybe $20,000, which at that time was a lot of money. If you wait," they said, if you wait 6 months, you know what's going to happen? You know, lots of other black families are going to move into the block, and once they move into the block, maybe I could be able to get you 12, maybe 10. If you wait an entire year, you're going to walk away from it altogether because you won't be able to live here anymore. And, you know, people got frightened. They literally got frightened. It was also a point in time when the Bronx was opening up, you know, those huge complexes, middle income, lower income housing was opening up in the Bronx, and there were other neighborhoods that were developing, and Long Island was flourishing. So there were places that people could go. And so they sold out, just sold out. So we were the last white family on the block. So, you know, I mean, it impacted on the rest of my sort of growing up years in the neighborhood. My father insisted on continuing to live in the neighborhood. He was the Rav of a shul, and I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. He was the rabbi of a shul, and he insisted that he was going to stay in the neighborhood for as long as they can continue to have a minyan. And in consequence of that, his was the last shul that still had a minyan in the neighborhood. All of the other shuls sold out. Some of them, whatever happened, they all sold out. And so his was the last shul left in the neighborhood. By that time, it wasn't only our block, and the whole surrounding neighborhood had become completely black. And as often happened at that point, and that's why Martin Luther King said what he said in 1963 about people moving, right, that blacks can only move from one ghetto to another, because if they move into a white neighborhood in order to improve their living conditions and the conditions of the schools into which their children would go, within 3 years, it was a black ghetto. It was just another black ghetto. My father insisted on continuing to live there. And at one point, you know, I was already in the dormitory at YU, and I came home one Shabbos, and the windows were broken, and it was a problem. And I said to my father, "How can you do this? I mean, you know, you're living here alone, you and mommy, and, you know, you shouldn't be living here anymore. It's not safe." So he said, "What do you mean it's not safe? It's perfectly safe." So I said, "Come on, what do you mean it's perfectly safe? You know what the crime rates are like out here?" And, you know, so he said, "So once in a while they'll break a window, someone who doesn't know better yet." I said, no, I mean, it's really not safe." So he said, "It's perfectly safe." I said, "How could it possibly be perfectly safe?" So he said as follows. He said it to me in Yiddish, but he said as follows. He said, "I'll tell you why." He says, "Because the black priests and ministers in the neighborhood have told their teenage kids that if they start up with the old rabbi, that they will burn in hell for all of eternity." He said, "So when I walk through the streets, the waters part for me, and they let me through, and I'm perfectly safe." And Baruch Hashem, I mean, I don't know whether it was his emunah or whatever it was that protected him, you know, and you know, Shomer Psalm Hashem, but he continued living there until they could no longer have a minyan, and then he moved out to Crown Heights and the Farakli. Now, so what I learned from that is that, you know, what's happening to blacks is that I learned from that there was a kind of exploitation that was going on that was unconscionable. Right? And that we were, in effect, had become complicit in the fact that the Jewish community had abandoned the neighborhood because one black family moved into the neighborhood. You know, and, you know, the same thing happened when I was rabbi in Boston. I was rabbi at Young Israel, Brookline, for a couple of years after Berkeley. and the community there had abandoned Dorchester and Mattapan, and had moved into Brookline and Newton, and there were lots of elderly Jews who were still stuck in the neighborhoods in Dorchester and Mattapan, and so I worked on helping to organize together with Black clergy in the area, developing racially mixed um, uh, um, civilian patrols in collaboration with the police, and we had civilian patrols out there every evening and night of the week, um, and it contributed to a kind of stability that made it possible for people to continue to live there. It was too late to save those neighborhoods, but at least to continue protecting the people who were still living there, both whites and blacks. So, I started out, and my father was a deep influence on me in this regard. Um, he was a Slabodka Yeshiva Bacher. When he came to the United States, he was in his late 20s. He had spent, many years, more than 10 years learning in Slabodka and Kovna before he came to the United States. And he had absorbed sort of a Mussar orientation that led him, despite everything that he experienced, despite everything that he had so personally experienced from the first war through later times, that we have to recognize the Tzelem Elokim of every individual human being.
So I do want to wrap up shortly because it's already 9 o'clock, which is like a half hour past where we said we'd go, but it's just I have to ask one final question if it's okay, I hope. So this came in as well. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit, sort of like two-part. You mentioned, which I never heard before, this idea from Rav Kook about chutzpah tita and Deilah. If you could like clarify that and elaborate about it a little bit, because a question came in around that. It's an incredible idea. And maybe in doing so, if you could also just sort of comment on, what you just shared, the story, of your father, and like in a sense, his social justice came out of Slobodka, and along it ties into that concept of the chutzpah ila'ah and what has happened with that for us, because it seems that most of the social justice today in the Jewish world is not coming out of Slobodka. It's coming out of American, 21st century democratic, progressive perhaps values, and what we could do for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren today, to make the Judaism that we are preaching be one that keeps them in the Judaism, but that the social justice and also pour out of Slobodka as well.
Right. So I guess the first thing that we have to do as a community is produce another 50 rabbis like you every year, and who will teach social justice as emerging from Torah, rather than social justice as emerging from liberal politics. Because in the final event, it's the issue at stake in so much of the conflict in the United States is not how can we best help the poor, right? I mean, after all, if you really want to see the biblical roots of that short piece of Martin Luther King's speech that I read to you at the very beginning, if you really want to see the roots of that, so read chapter 19 in Vayikra, because chapter 19 of Vayikra tells us, is the Torah's sort of social justice agenda. It's extraordinary. I mean, it's spread through the whole of the Torah, but there's this concentrated piece right there in chapter 19, right, in 10 consecutive verses, and then picked up at the end, right, the support of the poor, respect of private property, prohibition against economic fraud, the prohibition against lying, the prohibition against desecrating the name of God, the prohibition against emotional exploitation of vulnerable people, against use of violence in taking people's property, right, of failing to pay day workers on time, of failing to protect the disabled, of failing to live in awe of God, right, of a justice system that executes injustice, right, of the prohibition against against acting unrighteously in justice, prohibition against verbal abuse, the duty of rescue, prohibition against hatred, the duty of chastisement, the prohibition against varied kinds of vengeance, and ultimately, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, ani Hashem. And then, to the end of the chapter, God's saying, and you should know, this is not only for you, this is also the ger agar b'tochachem, right? If you're living amongst non-Jews, then these are the same principles for the society that you have to support when you're living amongst non-Jews. Whether the non-Jews are living amongst you or you're living amongst them. Because these are the standards fundamentally that are current as well in the Noahide commandments. And what Martin Luther King recognized was the sort of the power of the words of Torah. So I heard a lot of those kinds of forms of teaching of Torah with the recognition of the underlying sort of humane character, the underlying ethical demands. I heard that from my father as a product of the Muslim movement in Sabatka. I heard that from Abraham Joshua Heschel as a product of generations of Hasidic masters. And I heard that from Rabbi Soloveitchik as a product of Brisk. So did I hear that only? Am I the only one who heard that? I don't think I'm the only one who heard that. I don't think that I'm the only one who heard it from fathers. I don't think I'm the only one who heard it from Rabbi Heschel. I don't think I'm the only one who heard it from Rabbi Soloveitchik. So, but I think that we've sort of lost touch with the need to make that a conscious of not being afraid to say that this is what Torah is telling us to do, right? That our support of the poor and our unwillingness to tolerate, that 15% of children in the United States live lives of hunger, that we should not be willing to tolerate that because the Torah teaches us that we should not be willing to tolerate that. Or that the concern with the generational continuity of poverty is not something that Moynihan invented, but that the whole of the laws of Shemitah and Yovel have to do with the attempt to prevent the generational continuity of poverty. Because we know that today, if a child grows up in a home that lives off welfare, then they have a 10 times higher chance of living off welfare in the next generation. That if someone doesn't have the opportunity for an education that is fit for them, that they'll never make it in the world, except individuals, who'll make it despite anything. So, it seems to me that what Rav Kook was saying is fundamentally that same message. And that is that there is an ethical message in Torah and a spiritual message in Torah that we need to be willing to put out at the forefront. That's who we are. That's what we represent. So you want to argue about how to best achieve those goals? Fine. I'm willing to recognize that sometimes some of the most conservative ideas turn out to be the most productive ideas for helping poor people, or sometimes even reasonably valid ideas for helping immigrants, right? And we have to be willing to hear those ideas wherever they're coming from, so long as the core commitment is there that we as individuals and as a society have to help the poor, that we have to help immigrants, that we have a responsibility to support the disabled, that we have a responsibility to avoid people's, being emotionally harmed, that we have a responsibility for people's spiritual development, right? If we can agree on those fundamentals, and if we can see those as emerging from our Torah, then I think we have the capacity to hear lots of different ideas about how to achieve those goals. So that's what I think is, and I think what Rabbi Kook was already seeing in the 1920s and the early 30s. I mean, he died in 35 before the establishment of the Dinah, but he saw the sort of the visionary young Zionists, secular Zionists coming to Israel to build a nation, right? He saw that, and he was unwilling to say that they were secular. He was unwilling to say that they don't count. He wanted them to understand that from his perspective, they were engaged in the spiritual endeavor of building the land and the state of Israel so that the spiritual goals of Israel could be achieved in that state. And that, he said that in regard, with this I'll close, and you can decide whether you want to close, but Rav Kook used that same principle in regard to explain a problem in the weekday Amidah. And he makes reference to it in his commentary to the Sidur. In the weekday Amidah, Rav Kook said, there's something strange about the whole section of petitions. There's this sequence of sort of equally balanced 13 petitions. It's really 12 and a summation. And the 12 petitions are really very carefully organized. The first 6 have to do with the individual. The next 6 have to do with the nation. The first 6 having to do with the individual the first 3 with the individual spiritual needs, and then the individual material needs. And then the next 6 for the nation, that's inverted. The first 3 of that 6 deal with the material condition of the nation, and the last 3 can deal with their spiritual condition. And he asked the question, why are they reversed that way? To which his answer was, because for an individual, if an individual does not have the capacity to place their spiritual needs before their material needs, then you don't have a fighting chance. But for the nation, the reality is that if the nation doesn't exist, if the 3 petitions for the nation don't exist, if you don't have the ingathering of exiles, and you don't have the establishment of governance, the establishment of justice, and self-defense, if you don't have those 3 components, then you don't have you won't have a nation in which the spiritual identity can be built. Right? So he was deeply cognizant of this awareness that we have to have of, so to speak, both the ethical and the spiritual nature of Torah's teachings and the way in which we need to absorb that and transmit it to the next generation.
So in a moment, I'll thank Rabbi Berman. Before I do so, I want to tell everyone here that we'll be gathering this recording and Bezrat Hashem sending it out. And what you all need to do is you need to speak to your friends and your associates and tell them that they must watch this recording when it's sent out, because this was really, really special. I love, Rabbi Berman, how you infuse everything with spirituality, with holiness, with Torah. I got a message along the way from someone who was appreciating that, as you explained in those moments, holding cell, you thought about, how do I make Kiddush? And I don't have what to make Kiddush on, but I can make Kiddush D'Rabbanan. And it's so beautiful to hear. I can only imagine like that if I were there and I got myself through everything and they said we're getting on buses, I would have very easily said, okay, this is a Pikuach Nefesh issue. I can get on the bus. And somehow you managed to get 250 people with a police escort to march through the white part of town. So it's also in addition to everything else that you shared, just the courage of conviction and the importance of rituals that sometimes can get lost in a discussion around the importance of the social justice. It takes special people to put them together as you do. Thank you so very much for sharing so personally, so beautifully, in such an articulate and beautiful manner, the experiences that you had. I took a lot from it. I know others did. And we hope that we'll have other occasions to hear your beautiful Torah in the future.
Thank you all very much.
Rabbi Posner, Linda Yaffe here. I'd like to thank Rabbi Berman. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, yes. Linda. Please go ahead, Rabbi Berman. This is...
Okay. I really, it was such a privilege to hear this tonight. I didn't have the visual. I only was listening. And I can't tell you how moved I was when Rabbi Berman spoke about what he learned. That was so profound. And I think I really do think that this should go through the school for the students to hear this.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's due to Linda's generosity that we can have this program. And so thank you for your generosity and for your support. And you're right, the students should hear it as well. You can all go and tell Dr. Shore that she needs to make sure to actually get this out to the students.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Both people who I've known before and people who I've got a chance to see now. Rabbi Yogev, thanks. Wonderful to meet you this way. And the rest of you, please, everyone, take care. And remember that it is Rabbi Heschel's Yortzeit today. So include him and his neshama in your tefillot. And remember that Monday is commemoration of Martin Luther King. And you should also remember him and his neshama should also have an aliyah. He might not be able to get Sheni because he's not a Levi, but you know, an aliyah. Okay, everyone, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thank you.